This is Ian Hartley.
I am Warren Kay.
And I am Sasha Steenbergen.
Welcome to the Rediscovering God Dialogue.
We invite you to join us as we endeavor to see Him more clearly
And love Him more dearly while following Him more nearly. So here we are at part 2 in Genesis chapter 22 as we continue on this journey. And just a quick review, last podcast, we took some time to discuss the difference between God testing or tempting, and concluded that God does not tempt, as James makes really clear, but that at times he does test people, and we in turn test God. And so that was one of the things that stands out in my mind. Sasha, what stood out for you?
Yeah, and something that I was thinking about was the idea of how we're starting to hear that in the Old Testament, there are times where it says that God is speaking, and that we have seen that it may actually have been Satan who was speaking into that situation. And so that really stood out to me as something to consider, perhaps in this story as well.
Good.
So, yeah, thank you, Sasha and Warren. For me, the fact that Abraham did not protest this command from God, when he has a long history of protesting to God about things that God is apparently going to do, like destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, and also he can protest with other human beings. So he's not a pushover. He's not a doormat. He stands up for what he thinks is right, be it God or another human being. And this is missing in this story.
So now we continue on, and let's just take a look at some explanations offered for the proposed sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham.
Yeah, there are a number of different options. There are about 5 of them. The first one is that the story is a literal record of exactly what happened.
Mm-hmm.
The second one, the story is a prefiguring of how God would sacrifice his son. The third one is that Abraham had to learn that Isaac did not belong to him. This was actually God's child who was left to him. Fourthly, Abraham, because of his faults and failures, felt the need to do something to make restitution, placate, appease, or big word, propitiate God. This was very common in the surrounding nations, that you had to do something to make your God like you.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, Abraham thought it was God's voice, but he was deceived by his own devious nature. And I think that's the point that Sasha was making. So we're going to go through these different options, and we might find another option in our dialogue, and we'll add it to the discussion. So this is not exhaustive, these 5 points, or exhausting. So let's have a look at number 1. The story is a literal record of exactly what happened. And I would guess that most sincere Bible readers read the story that way. It happened just like it's written.
Yeah.
So we're going to look at some problems that you have to deal with if you read the story this way. This means God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son as the surrounding pagan nations did. If this explanation is accepted, then one has to reconcile it with the following scriptures, over 20 of which express God's abhorrence of child sacrifice. So we need to read some of them for their impact. We're not going to read Exodus 20:13. the law which says thou shalt not kill. Some people say murder is a better translation. But let's look at Deuteronomy 12:31 for beginners. So these are all passages which tell us that God absolutely abhors child sacrifice. Deuteronomy 12:31.
You must not worship the Lord your God the way the other nations worship their gods, for they perform for their gods every detestable act that the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters as sacrifices to their gods.
Okay, notice now, that's an example of the detestable acts that God hates.
Mhm.
It's sacrificing your children.
Mm-hmm.
While we're in Deuteronomy 18, verse 10.
Go ahead and read that one too, Sasha.
Mhm. For example, never sacrifice your son or daughter as a burnt offering, and do not let your people practice fortune telling or use sorcery or interpret omens or engage in witchcraft.
Okay, so I want to remind you that Abraham was going to offer Isaac as a burnt offering. So
Mhm.
you can't use the explanation, well, he wasn't going to burn his child in the fire. I know that strictly speaking, that's what they did when they worshipped Moloch. But this was to be a burnt offering. So I don't know, when you read these verses, how do you feel about child sacrifice? Well, I hope you feel that God does not want it and
Yeah.
sees it as an abomination.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's horrific.
So 2 Kings 3:27.
Then the king of Moab took his oldest son, who would have been the next king, and sacrificed him as a burnt offering on the wall. So there was great anger against Israel, and the Israelites withdrew and returned to their own land.
So here you have a king sacrificing his son to save the city, and it works.
Mm-hmm.
The Israelites stop attacking, and they go home to Jerusalem.
Mhm.
So it's very clear that the surrounding nations sacrificed their children to gain their God's favor. Now there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more references in Kings about how child sacrifice arouses God's anger. By the way, for our listeners, there is a document that accompanies to each podcast where you can get this information just by looking at the document or downloading it. Save you trying to write down all this information.
Right.
2 Chronicles 28, verse 3. 2 Chronicles 28, verse 3.
I forget. Is it me?
Yes.
Okay. He offered sacrifices in the valley of Ben Hinnom, even sacrificing his own sons in the fire. In this way, he followed the detestable practices of the pagan nations, and the Lord had driven from the land ahead of the Israelites.
Thank you. Pagan nations do that. It is not God's people.
Mhm.
Psalm 106, 37 to 40.
They even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the demons. They shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters, by sacrificing them to the idols of Canaan. They polluted the land with murder. They defiled themselves by their evil deeds, and their love of idols was adultery in the Lord's sight. That is why the Lord's anger burned against his people, and he abhorred his own special possession.
So this is the Israelites that are doing this.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a temptation to them, and they succumbed to it periodically. Isaiah 57, verse 5.
You worship your idols with great passion beneath the oaks and under every green tree. You sacrifice your children down in the valleys among the jagged rocks in the cliffs.
Yeah. So these are God's people doing this. Jeremiah 7:31.
They have built pagan shrines at Topheth, the garbage dump in the valley of Ben Hinnom. and there they burn their sons and daughters in the fire. I have never commanded such a horrible deed, yet never even crossed my mind to command such a thing.
We'll come back to this verse a little bit later.
And this is talking about the people of Judah.
Yes. Ezekiel 16, 20 to 21.
Then you took your sons and daughters, the children you had borne to me, and sacrificed them to your God. Was your prostitution not enough? Must you also slaughter my children by sacrificing them to idols?
Thank you. So this is the context in which Micah writes when he says in Micah 6, verse 7, shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? And then 6 verse 8 is a very well-known verse where God responds by saying, no, I don't want you to do that. What I want from you is to have mercy and to follow in my laws and to walk humbly with your God. So in Jeremiah 7:22, somebody just read Jeremiah 7:31. I want to read Jeremiah 7:22.
When I led your ancestors out of Egypt, it was not burnt offerings and sacrifices I wanted from them. This is what I told them: obey me, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. Do everything I say, and all will be well.
Thank you. This is a startling verse. It says, it was not burnt offerings and sacrifices I wanted from them, which means they certainly offered burnt offerings and sacrifices. So who wanted to offer those sacrifices?
Yeah, the people.
The people. And some of, go ahead.
Well, it seems that when God put in place the sanctuary service, he was saying, when you offer sacrifices, do it in this way. So it's implied that they were offering sacrifices. He was guiding them as to how to do it to make it meaningful if they insisted on doing it. But his intention was never to have them offering all these sacrifices to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And some scholars have suggested that all these animals that were sacrificed were to try and stop the Israelites from sacrificing their children.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the problem with reading the story literally. You've got all these passages. Now, the best argument I've heard is that Abraham lived before all these prophets wrote. Abraham lives 500 years before Moses, the first prophet that writes. And so this information only came to God's people from Moses onwards. So it wasn't there for Abraham.
Yeah, true. But you've got to keep God as a consistent being. If he's saying, I never even imagined doing this, then he's got a short memory or there's a big problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, the words that just never gotten written down. How he felt about it.
So we're going to read Jesus' comment on Abraham and killing a little later on. So let's have a look at the second explanation. Is the story is a prefiguring of how God would have to sacrifice his son. So the argument is that Abraham is privileged to share this parallel experience with God and will understand God's sacrifice better. This view is used to justify the penal substitution theory of the atonement, which is based on the understanding that God needed the death of Jesus to be legally reconciled to sinners. Now, I want to remind you that this idea of the atonement pretty much was brought into Christians' attention with John Calvin and Martin Luther. It's not an old theory, like not substitution, but the healing model and various other moral influence theory being another one. And the defeating the devil was another one. This is a relatively modern idea that Jesus couldn't forgive us legally. Now, the word legal is very important here. It's imposing a legal model on God. I choose my words carefully. Imposing a legal model on God. In other words, it's not a natural model. It's something that men have made up and imposed on God. By the way, Calvin was a lawyer, civil lawyer, and Luther was an expert in canon law, meaning church law. So they were both legally inclined, and this was the way they understood it. Now, the question that we have to think about is the solution to the sin problem a legal one or a moral one? Now, people who believe it's a legal one, they would say it's both. So let me explain what we mean by a moral problem. If there's not enough place in the lifeboats for everybody, somebody has to give up their space on the lifeboat. Now, there's no law which says who must give up their place on the lifeboat. You know, the English had this, they regarded themselves as very moral people. So they would say, women and children first, and if there's place, the men can join them. Okay? So that was sort of a moral understanding. You can say, well, it was sort of legal. But who does not get into the lifeboat is a moral question. It's not, there's no legal. You might have a tradition like the British claim they do. But we have no law written down which determines who gets in the lifeboat. This is a moral situation that needs to be dealt with when the ship is sinking. Are you tracking with me on the moral problem?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but then I want you to make the connection between how that affects the story and Jesus.
We'll come to that.
Okay.
Jesus crossed the moral divide for us. Well, let me just respond to it quickly. See, the difference between Jesus and every other martyr is that Jesus laid down his life. It wasn't taken from him. We tried to take it from him in the Garden of Gethsemane. We tried to take it from him in torture. We tried to take it from him by wanting to stone him, but we couldn't. The only way Jesus could die was if he laid down his life. And when he laid down his life, he demonstrated that there's nothing selfish in God's heart. See, now that's the moral solution. It's not a legal solution. It's telling you something about the moral quality of the way God thinks and feels.
Yeah.
Good distinction between a moral issue or a legal issue.
So look, law, well, human beings make laws, and that's good. I mean, it's not bad to have law because law orders society. But every law human beings have ever made is because of a problem. Like if you put up a speeding law around schools and say you can only travel 30 kilometers an hour in this area close to the school, that is because there have been people traveling fast that have hurt children or maybe even killed them. And so we made a law in response to evil. Now you need law because you don't have love.
Mhm.
If the drivers past the school love children, they would automatically slow down.
Mm-hmm.
So every law is an admission of a lack of love. So Moses was a lawman. He was trained in the courts of Egypt. He
Mm-hmm.
was trained in the art of law and battle. And so this is his legacy. And I'm not putting him down in any way. I'm just saying we have to recognize people's backgrounds, because that's going to help you understand the way they're going to think and feel.
Mhm. Mhm.
You know, somebody said, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah.
So that's just a truism, which is saying whatever you're equipped with, that's how you're going to deal with your environment.
Mhm.
Well, and it seems even bigger than Moses, because that's the way that God related to them as they came out of Egypt too. And he gave them this whole pack of laws that they should live by to bring some order into their society.
Yeah. So now, in John chapter 8, we're going to read this. Jesus is adamant that Abraham did not use death as a method of dealing with his enemies or friends. Just add that in there. So I want us to read John 8:39 to 44.
Our father is Abraham, they declared. No, Jesus replied. If you were really the children of Abraham, you would follow his example. Instead, you're trying to kill me because I told you the truth, which I heard from God. Abraham never did such a thing. No,
So
you
let me
were.
just stop you there, Warren.
Yes.
When Jesus says Abraham never did such a thing, contextually, he never tried to kill someone.
Mm-hmm.
So I remind you that we're talking about Abraham and Isaac, and Abraham apparently called by God to kill his son.
Mm-hmm. And so Jesus seems to be questioning whether that's what God was calling Abraham to do.
Well, by implication, yes.
Yeah, by implication. Continuing with verse 41. No, you are imitating your real father. They replied, we aren't illegitimate children. God himself is our true father. Jesus told them, if God were your father, you would love me because I have come to you from God. I am not here on my own, but he sent me. Why can't you understand what I am saying? It's because you can't even hear me. You are the children of your father, the devil, and you love to do the evil things he does. He was a murderer from the beginning, and he has always hated the truth, because there's no truth in him. When he lies, it is consistent with his character, for he is a liar and a father of lies. Wow, that's a pretty resounding condemnation on those people.
Well, and the reason we're reading it is that they claim their father is Abraham initially, and at the same time, they're ready to kill Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't see the killing of Jesus as inconsistent with Abraham.
Yeah.
Okay? And Jesus says, look, if you really were Abraham's children, you wouldn't be trying to kill me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then they say, okay, actually, God is our father. But then it also works there. If God is your father, he wouldn't be trying to kill me. No, actually, your father is the devil, and he's a murderer from the beginning.
Yeah. He's the one that brings death.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So behind Cain killing Abel is the devil.
Mm-hmm. And
So,
I would think, and every death since then, it's been the devil that's been behind it.
yeah. And Hebrews 2, verse 14 backs up what you're saying, is that the devil is the one who has the power of death.
Mm-hmm.
So I remind you, we're looking at the alternative, suggesting that this story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac is a prefiguring of how God would have to kill his son on the cross. And we've just read John 8, where Jesus says, look, God is not like that.
Mm-hmm.
That the idea of killing somebody is from the devil.
Yeah.
So we've totally misunderstood this story and read things into it that just were never intended to be there.
Well, the writer also wrote it in terms of his understanding of
True.
what happened. So,
Yeah.
yeah, we can read it more perceptively. I'm not disagreeing with you, but it's also written in such a way that you can easily just go with the literal reading.
Mm-hmm.
So the third explanation is that Abraham had to learn that Isaac did not belong to him. Now, this is the pretty much standard Jewish interpretation of this story, is that Abraham had to learn that this son was a gift to him, and he did not own this child. He had to be willing to give it up.
Yeah.
And the information we're going to look at comes from someone who was the chief rabbi of the British Empire, Jonathan Sacks. So he's a pretty influential voice in Judaism. We're not just picking some rabbi or some rabbi's teaching. We're talking about a very influential rabbi in Judaism today. It is, and this idea is persuasive because Jesus said, if you lose your life, you gain it.
Hmm.
And so if Abraham was willing to lose Isaac in sacrifice, he would gain something better than this kind of thinking. And yet, as Jonathan Sacks points out, throughout the Tanakh is their title for what we call the Old Testament. Throughout the Tanakh, the gravest sin is child sacrifice. The Torah and the prophets consistently regard it with horror. It is what pagans do. So Sacks is asking, how can this be that Abraham's asked to sacrifice Isaac? Because this is what pagans do. And the Old Testament is totally against it. And then he gives this example of Mesha, the king of Moab, does to get the gods to give him victory over the Israelites. So I want us to read it again with a bit more detail. 2 Kings 3, 26 to 27.
When the king of Moab saw that the battle had gone against him, he took with him 700 swordsmen to break through to the king of Edom, but they failed. Then he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him as a king, and offered him as a sacrifice on the city wall. The fury against Israel was great. They withdrew and returned to their own land.
So here you've got an example to prove that child sacrifice works. You know, you can never base good theory,
it seems
good understanding on anecdotal stories.
So it seems to me his motive for sacrificing fired up his people to such an extent that the Israelites thought, we better back off because these guys they're really upset with us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm quoting from Sacks. How can the Torah regard as Abraham's supreme achievement that he was willing to do what the worst of idolaters do? The fact that Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son would seem to make him, in terms of Tanakh, considered as a whole, no better than Baal or Moloch worshippers or the pagan king of Moab. This cannot be the only possible interpretation. So here you've got an expert on the Old Testament, saying that literally, you can't read this story literally, because it makes Abram a pagan.
Yeah.
And yet he's the father of the chosen people. Sachs concludes that the lesson the Lord wanted Abram to learn was that Isaac did not belong to him, but to the Lord. Sachs is a representative voice of Judaism, but it does not have the authority of Christ's voice, who commands us to love our enemies. So now we come to option number 4. Abram, because of his faults and failures, felt the need to do something to make restitution, placate, appease, or propitiate God. He needed to give up something to show his remorse, as is done during Lent or Ramadan and the laws of restitution. He had blackened the name of God with his lying about Sarah to Pharaoh and to Abimelech. He had followed Sarai's suggestion of having the promised son via Hagar. He had cruelly sent away Hagar and Ishmael into the desert. So he's very much aware of his failures. And so he has some stories in the Old Testament which demonstrate the idea that the Lord or other gods needed to be placated by human sacrifices. You might be surprised to learn. Well, we have covered some of them in previous podcasts. So King David, when there was a drought in Israel, was willing to have the Gibeonites execute 2 sons and 5 grandsons of Saul to placate the Lord. Now, I want to read the story, just sort of touch on it, not read the whole story. 2 Samuel chapter 21. We need to read verse 1.
There was a famine during David's reign that lasted for 3 years. So David asked the Lord about it, and the Lord said, "The famine has come because Saul and his family are guilty of murdering the Gibeonites."
Yeah, so it's a famine because Saul murdered some of the Gibeonites. Better read on a bit there for us, Warren.
So the king summoned the Gibeonites. They were not part of Israel, but were all that was left of the nation of the Amorites. The people of Israel had sworn not to kill them because Saul, in his zeal for Israel and Judah, had tried to wipe them out. David asked them, "What can I do for you? How can I make amends so that you will bless the Lord's people again?" "Well, money can't settle this matter between us and the family of Saul," the Gibeonites replied. "Neither can we demand the life of anyone in Israel." "What can I do then?" David asked. "Just tell me and I will do it for you." Then they replied, "It was Saul who planned to destroy us, to keep us from having any place at all in the territory of Israel. So let 7 of Saul's sons be handed over to us, and we will execute them before the Lord at Gibeon on the mountain of the Lord." "All right," the king said, "I will do it."
So he does this. And he takes the 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Ai. She was one of his concubines. They listed there. He also gave them the 5 sons of Saul's daughter, Merab, the wife of Adriel, son of Barzillai from Meholah. The men of Gibeon executed them on the mountain before the Lord. So all 7 of them died at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now notice what happens in verse 14. If you can read that for us.
Then the king ordered that they bury the bones in the tomb of Kish, Saul's father, at the town of Zelah in the land of Benjamin. And after that, God ended the famine in the land.
So here you've got the solution of a drought by human sacrifice.
Well, and it's tough because it starts out by saying that God said that the reason for the famine was because, Saul and his family were guilty of murdering. And so to end the story with, you know, the murder has happened and God ended the famine. I mean, if we're reading literally, that's pretty tough.
Yeah. And this is the problem, is that people who read the Bible literally, they get stuck with a story like this. There's no idea that this possibly wasn't God's voice,
Mhm.
and that whatever David heard was another voice talking to him.
It's another example where he has created God in his own image.
Yeah.
And this is the way he would deal with things, and so he's projected that onto God, and that's the way the story gets written.
So this is another example of, you can't read all these stories literally.
Mhm.
They just put you in a quandary, and you end up not knowing what to believe.
Mhm.
Is that does God really operate this way?
Hmm.
So we've read about the king of Moab, who sacrificed his son to placate his God. Now, there's an interesting one in Jonah 1 verse 12 that we need to read. Jonah 1 verse 12.
Throw me into the sea, Jonah said, and it will become calm again. I know that this terrible storm is all my fault.
So behind Jonah's offer of his execution by drowning is his idea that God has brought the storm on the ship, and that if he gives his life, the sailors will be saved.
Mhm.
God will be placated.
Well, it's just tough then that once they do, the storm stops immediately. Oh boy.
So I think you begin to see the problem we have with the idea of Israelites thinking they need to placate God with human sacrifice,
Mhm.
whether it's Saul's children or Jonah's own life. And we read about Micah, who asked, shall I offer the firstborn for my transgression? And he answers, no, O people, the Lord has told you what is good. And this is what he requires of you, to do what's right, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. So in Abraham's attempt to sacrifice his son, God provided a ram. In Jonah's case, he provided a fish to negate these human attempts to placate him with human life given in death. The concept of the need to placate a God with human life is widespread in human history, with the most persuasive offerings being that of the firstborn child or a virgin girl. The Lord is different, as he points out to Moses at the golden calf episode. He cannot accept substitution, the innocent in place of the guilty. This conversation with God, I've very seldom heard anybody comment on it. So we need to read it. Exodus 32, verse 32 to 33.
But now, if you will only forgive their sin, but if not, erase my name from the record you have written. But the Lord replied to Moses, no, I will erase the name of everyone who has sinned against me.
So Moses is offering himself as a sacrifice for Israel's sin. And God says, no, I don't accept a substitute.
Mm-hmm.
I punish the people who are guilty, not the innocent.
Mm-hmm.
Now that concept strikes at the very heart of animal substitution or human substitution for the penalty of sin. Death is the consequence of sin. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And the penalty of sin, the wages of sin, is death. This does not mean that if you sin, somebody is going to punish you by killing you. It means that once you sin, it is inevitable that you will want to die. If you live long enough, you'll want to die.
Mm-hmm.
Because life without God is so miserable that eventually it's not worth living.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen part of this in seniors' homes. You know, people who get to 90 plus, usually they tell me, you know, I'm a burden on society. I wish the Lord would come and take me. It's a common song they sing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the consequence of sin.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a punishment from God. It's the end result of living a life independent of God, which Adam bequeathed to each one of us.
I'm just thinking that I think it's so important that every time these verses come up, like the one that you just read about how he, said there's no substitution, and I will, what was the word that he used? I
will erase the name of everyone who has sinned against me.
Yeah. And then like the word condemn or punish or all these things, it's like, this is sort of this belief idea that somehow he will do something to the people who are the guilty parties, right? And this is what we have always wanted, is that the person, the perpetrator will pay, or that there will be justice. And the reframe that you're offering, Ian, I just think that every single time we need to hear that reframe in order for that to slowly start sinking in, that really it's not at the end of the day God saying, I'm now going to punish the people who are guilty or have sinned, but that really is the people who are wanting that separation or not wanting to be with God, and that it has absolutely nothing to do with an act that God is doing to the people. And I think that distinction is so pivotal, because when we read these verses, and I've grown up with these verses, that it sounds like, God is angry when the people sin, and he's like, don't worry, I'm going to take care of them at the end, and I'm going to make sure that they all pay for what they did. Yeah. And thank you for highlighting that again. I was worried that would slip by without you mentioning it, and you did mention it. So thank you.
So I'm going to back it up with 3 passages.
Good.
And 2 of them come from John 8:44. We've read it, but we need to read it again. And then we're going to read John 10:10, and then Hebrews 2:14, and we're done for the podcast.
Good.
John 8:44.
For you are the children of your father, the devil, and you love to do the evil things he does. He was a murderer from the beginning. He has always hated the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, it is consistent with his character, for he is a liar and the father of lies.
This is horrible that Jesus had to tell the religious leaders of his day that you are murderers and liars, just like your father, the devil. So the other verse in John that we want to read is John 10:10, which is the most succinct statement of the reality we're talking about.
The thief's purpose is to steal and kill and destroy. My purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life. Amen.
So we've just identified the thief in John 8:44, the murderer and the liar. And Jesus' purpose is to give every person a rich and satisfying life. That's why he came to earth.
Amen.
And Jesus is the very character of God, the very image of God.
And he gives us three characteristics. He is the way, the truth, and the life. He's the way to God. He's the truth about God. And he has the life of God in himself. And he can give it to us. Hebrews 2:14.
And because God's children are human beings made of flesh and blood, the Son also became flesh and blood. For only as a human being could he die, and only by dying could he break the power of the devil, who had the power of death.
Only by dying could he break the power of death. Read the last statement for me.
Could he break the power of the devil, who had the power of death?
Thank you. Could he break the power of the devil, who has the power of death? God would never call for the death of one of his children. The devil would call for the death of all God's children. We will look at explanation number 5 in the next podcast. Let's pray together. Dear God, we want to discern your voice. There are many voices that come to us and in this world. And we know that the enemy is supernaturally intelligent and clever and has a million disguises to deceive us. Thank you for protecting us. Amen.
Amen.
Find the recording of our podcast on our website, as well as the PDF document that we've been using, so you can follow along or at least see all the passages. And so that website is rediscoveringgod.ca, and on there is the PDF document, the link for the podcast, as well as our YouTube link. We are now on YouTube. So if you want to see us live, then you can go and watch it on YouTube.
Wonderful. And we'd also love to invite you to our Monday evening Zoom discussion where Ian and Warren lead us out. And we are currently going through the podcast where we get to have discussion and really dive in a little deeper and get our most pressing questions answered. It's a really wonderful time of fellowship and connection with the group. We share in community and resources as well. We'd really love to have you join us. We're going to be meeting at 6:30 Mountain Standard Time. You just add in the link 403-506-9201. We'd love to see you.
And if you'd like to connect with us, you can reach us at rediscoveringgod2020@gmail.com. Send us an email. We'd love to hear from you and know how this journey of rediscovering the God that Jesus knew is changing your life. Take care.